Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see you back at a garden club meeting. The last time we had a meeting was on the beautiful subject of lavender, growing lavender in New Jersey. And of course, we've had very active garden sales, the plant sales, and we've seen each other around the hill. But I'm very grateful to Kathy Walz for steering this new uh, category of programs, as it were, for us on learning something which is something which is educational, and also it's not something which is just an academic exercise, but what can each one of us do about it. And really looking forward to this presentation. Kathy is, she's works day in and day out and has been doing this, for nearly 24 years now. And, she's a heritage ecologist, and we are proud that she's also a Mount Tabor resident and can bring all such knowledge to us, at our doorstep, literally, and on our screens. So we're grateful to you. And it's lovely that Kathleen Biggins and Margaret Seek are both here from the Sea Change, not SEA change, but Sea as for climate change. And they're going to talk to us about something very, very close to all of us. It's not some subject which is some faraway topic in some other, country or some part of the world. Every day we are being impacted. We are actually witnessing all the things that people have talked about all these years, and we kind of didn't take it very seriously. We kind of thought it was, it's a big topic, it's something large, it doesn't really affect us, but it affects each and every one of us. And over to Kathy Walz to start the program. Thank you for joining.
Good evening. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Kathy Walz and I live in Mount Tabor. As an ecologist working for the Natural Heritage Program at the New Jersey DEP, I have been involved in climate change issues and have contributed to a recently published New Jersey scientific report on climate change. So I've been involved with this for quite a while. I first heard the Sea Change Conversations present their primer on climate change last year to the Nature Conservancy in Chester, and I was extremely impressed with the balanced and thorough presentation on a topic that's certainly complex and sometimes controversial. So I'm really pleased to introduce a community conversation on climate change to the Mount Tabor Garden Club tonight. So Kathleen Biggins is the founder and president of the nonprofit Sea Change Conversations, which she created to bring moderates and conservatives into the conversation about climate change. While attending the Garden Club of America's National Affairs and Legislation Conference in Washington, D.C. in February 2006, she was surprised to hear from a military general, business leaders, and renowned scientists that climate change was a real issue with far-ranging implications. She began to study the issue in earnest and recognized that it was a complex one that was not being communicated well in the press or in her peer groups. After Hurricane Sandy devastated her hometown of Princeton, she decided to take action. As a professional journalist and co-host of an internet radio show that explores environmental issues in the greater Delaware Valley, and as a member of the Garden Club of Princeton, Kathleen used her passion for education and outreach on the critical issue of climate change to found Sea Change Conversations in the year 2014. So Kathleen invited like-minded citizens from across the political spectrum to join her in creating a speaker series, which would showcase nonpartisan experts who moderates and conservatives would find credible. Seeking to deepen her community's understanding of the issue, Kathleen worked with climate and energy experts to develop a nonpartisan, scientifically based presentation, the Sea Change Primer, or Climate Change 101, providing a 360-degree view of the issues, scientific, economic, and policy ramifications. Since presenting the Sea Change Primer and serving as a keynote speaker in 2017 and 18 at the Garden Club of America's National Affairs and Legislation Conference in DC, she has given this presentation to almost 10,000 people in 29 states. That's really impressive. We are indeed lucky to have her with us here tonight for our Mount Tabor Garden Club meeting. So tonight we'll be presenting the Sea Change Conversation Primer. It's a 55-minute video that is captivating and informative. We ask you to mute your audio and also hide your video feed to make sure that our Zoom runs really smoothly. During the presentation, I'm sure questions will come up, and please feel free to type those into the chat function. The way you do that is you kind of scroll over the Zoom image and there'll be a line of options on the bottom, and chat is one of them. You can click on that and you can enter your question and then post it, and we will get those questions. And then after the presentation, we'll have a live Q&A, a question and answer session with Kathleen Biggins and a volunteer team member, Margaret Seek, who is a retired sports editor and who served for a number of years as the co-head of conservation with Kathleen for the Garden Club of Princeton. So they bring a wealth of knowledge in many different fields, but have really focused out on climate change. So I will hand it over now to Kathleen.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yes, thank you. You know, I can see you guys a little bit too. That's great. It is such a pleasure to be with you virtually. I'm so sorry we couldn't do it in person, but I'm very excited to be able to share a message with you. We were started in some ways from a garden club, and because we came together that way, we started off as all women. Hold on one second. There we go. So this is our team back in Princeton. And again, we crossed the political spectrum, and we now have some chapters that are forming around the country, and there are about 20 volunteers all around, and it's all been done on volunteer power, which has been quite an amazing ride. So whenever I walk into a Zoom call to talk about climate change, I recognize that I don't walk in alone. I say that we walk in with 3 800-pound gorillas with us. And the first 800-pound gorilla is the fact that the climate has always been changing due to natural causes. There have been crocodile-like creatures in the Arctic, there have been ice ages, but this time scientists say it's different, that after a remarkable stable period of over 10,000 years when our civilization flourished, man, through our activity, are triggering a period of instability. And we're doing it at a time when there are about 7.7 billion of us on the planet today, and 9 to 10 billion projected by mid-century. And we can't just move our cities and pick up our lean-tos like we used to do to follow the food and water as they reacted to changing climates. The second 800-pound gorilla in the room with us is the fact that fossil fuels have been incredible friends to us. Before we discovered them, our lives were short and brutal. They have given us a vibrant economy and a very high quality of life. But scientists say, if we continue to use them the way we have in the past, they will begin to do the opposite, actually decrease our GDP and lower our quality of life, especially for our kids and our grandkids. And the third 800-pound gorilla in the room with us is the fact that this is a tough topic to talk about. Perhaps it was banned from your Thanksgiving table. It was from mine for many years. But it wasn't always that way. George W. Bush, the Republican president, recommended a cap and trade approach to climate change in his first year of office. There were multiple bipartisan bills introduced to Congress every single year during his term. In 2007, the Republican leader Newt Gingrich did a commercial with Nancy Pelosi about using cap and trade to solve the problem. And in 2008, it was on both parties' presidential platform. Different ways of addressing it, but agreeing that it needed to be addressed. So what happened? Well, scientists who were active during that period tell us that when Al Gore won the Nobel Peace Prize for his movie on climate change, An Inconvenient Truth, it was a watershed moment. Something that had begrudging acceptance across the party lines suddenly became labeled a liberal issue. And we had a new litmus test for what made a good liberal or a good conservative. And the media really didn't help. On the left, many on the far left press wrote that in order to solve climate change, we had to be anti-car, anti-cow, and anti-capitalism. And on the right, they really began to cover it more as a social war issue instead of a scientific one. In fact, Fox News, research shows that Fox News in 2006 had about 50% of its coverage saying that climate change was real and posed a problem. And by 2009, 90% said it was a hoax. So we had a real hardening across party lines. But if you fast forward to today, the vast majority of Americans say they understand climate change is happening. And a strong majority say they understand that it is influenced by man's activities. But what Americans across the spectrum say is they don't really understand how urgent it is and how it will impact them personally. And that is what this presentation is designed to help with. We are not scientists, but we worked very closely with scientists and energy policy experts who developed this presentation. And it has been vetted by scientists and climate experts at Tufts, at Duke, at Yale, at Princeton, and at Rutgers. Now, one of the groups that we follow very closely is the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication. And about 5 years ago, they came out with a presentation that said Americans across the spectrum had 5 major questions on climate change. And we decided to use those 5 questions to organize this presentation. So what are the 5 questions most Americans have? Well, the first one is, how do we know it's real? The second, how do we know it's us? The third, what do the scientists think? The fourth, is it dangerous? And the fifth, is there hope? So let's jump into that first question. How do we know it's real? For one thing, it's because we have understood the basic physics of how greenhouse gases work and how they impact the climate for over 150 years, and it is well accepted. Let's go back to science class for a minute. When the solar energy comes down, it passes through our atmosphere and strikes our Earth's surface. Some of that energy is absorbed, but quite a lot of it ricochets back out into space. And when it does so, it is at a different wavelength. And this new wavelength is partially captured by a minute portion of our atmosphere that is made up of greenhouse gases, primarily water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Without these tiny little bits of greenhouse gases, we would have a frozen planet. So they play a very important job. But when we add to them, it simply means they capture more of that ricocheting energy and re-radiate it back to the Earth in higher quantities, warming us up further and adding energy into our climate systems. Another way to think about this is thinking about the carbon dioxide balance. I think many of us know that there is a balance between plants and animals with carbon dioxide, but we may not know that there's also a balance in where nature stores it, in the earth, in the oceans, and in the atmosphere. And if we focus on those bottom 2 words, fossil fuels, and think about what they are, I think it will really help us understand what's happening. Fossil fuels are little bits of plant and animal matter, perhaps a dinosaur that fell into the muck millions of years ago, got silted over, and with time, heat, and pressure, got turned back into pools of carbon, what we call fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. And mankind came along and said, wow, really rich in energy, really portable, really storable. I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it to heat my homes, to power my transportation, to run my factories, and to create these incredibly complex economies. And life was good. But in doing so, humans were taking carbon dioxide that nature had sequestered, that had pulled deep down underground over millions of years, and started to pump it up into the atmosphere at the alarmingly fast rate of over 40 billion tons of carbon every single year, much faster than it happens in nature normally. And at the same time as we're pumping all that carbon out of the earth and into the sky, we're cutting down our trees, we're marginalizing our wetlands and our meadows, which is adding even more natural carbon dioxide and also making it harder for nature to get back into the old balance. How are we putting those emissions up? Well, primarily through our transportation and electricity sectors, a little less in industry, commercial, and agriculture. Though I should note, while in this country, agriculture only puts out about 10% of the emissions, on a global perspective, it's more like 24. So scientists understand the basic science. They are also measuring it every single day at over 10,000 sites from the top of the atmosphere down into the oceans and all around the planet. And on top of that, they're adding satellite information. And you can imagine that all that raw data is kind of hard to create a big picture from. But luckily for us, there are quite a few agencies around the world that are tasked in doing exactly that. Whether it's NOAA or NASA in our country, the Met Hadley Center over in England, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, or the Japan Meteorological Agency, when they independently analyze all that raw data, they come up with the exact same big picture. And that is that we have raised the temperature about 1.2 degrees Celsius, which is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer doesn't sound like a big deal. In fact, it may sound like a really nice thing on a cold winter's day. But small changes in our average global temperature make for big changes on how we experience life on the surface. We're going to get more into that as we go into the presentation, but don't let the small numbers fool you. So scientists are measuring it, but they're also observing it, and we can too. Let's take a look at climate change in action with our own eyes. So what we are looking at here is a graphic from NOAA that shows how the Arctic Ocean is changing and how the mature ice, which is depicted in white, is melting and leaching away and being replaced by immature ice and open water, which are depicted in light blue and dark blue. And as you can see, from 1990 up to current times, we have lost a tremendous amount of that mature ice. And the reason why that is so significant is because that mature ice is highly reflective. It acts as almost like a windshield screen does in our car, reflecting some of that initial solar radiance back out into space. When we lose it, it simply means that more of that initial solar radiance will warm up the Earth, warming us up further. In addition, it means that we now have ice-free borders in much of the Arctic, which causes all sorts of geopolitical ramifications. And it means that our Navy has an entire new ocean to patrol, which has budgetary ramifications. But ice isn't just in the oceans, it's also on land. Take a look at these two pictures of the Muir Glacier in Alaska that was taken at the exact same place, exact same time of year, about 60 years apart. You can see it really looks like an entirely different planet, right? And this is happening all around the world. In our own Glacier National Park, when it was founded in 1910, there were 150 large glaciers. Today, there's only a handful, and they're all expected to melt away in the next 15 years. So scientists are measuring it, they're observing it, but they have another way to explain that they know climate change is happening. And that is through the discipline called paleoclimatology, which enables us to kind of look back through time. Paleoclimatologists study proxies, things like ancient ice, ancient trees, ancient lake beds and seabeds, and ancient corals, to see how today is different than yesteryear. And perhaps the ice cores are the most intriguing because these can go back 800,000 years. And scientists like this one can look inside and find tiny little air pockets that formed when snow fell and froze over. And he can liberate those air pockets and discern exactly what the carbon levels were going back 800,000 years. And what do the paleoclimatologists tell us? They tell us that we are in uncharted territory, that humans have never been on this earth when carbon dioxide levels were this high. So let's look a little more closely. Going all the way back to 800,000 years ago, you can see that our carbon dioxide levels bandied between 150 and 300 parts per million. These were through the natural cycles the Earth has always gone through. These were through ice age and thaw, ice age and thaw. And then you can see in 1910, we crossed over 300 parts per million, breaking out of the natural pattern. In 2019, we're at 411 parts per million. And scientists say if we continue on our current emissions path, we could hit close to 1,000 parts per million at the end of this century. And since we know that global temperature and carbon dioxide always move in lockstep, and we know that parts of the carbon dioxide we put up today will be in the air 1,000 years from now, we know that we are baking in temperature changes for generations as far out as we can envision. So hopefully you're with me that climate change is real. Let's move to the second question. How do we know it's us? Well, scientists have another discipline to explain how they know this, and this is the discipline of atmospheric chemistry. Atmospheric chemists can literally measure which carbon dioxide molecules in the air come from the burning of fossil fuels, come from man's activity, because they have a different isotope, a different ratio, if you will. So we know exactly how much we are putting up. Another way that they know that it's us is that when they put into the models all the things that naturally impact the climate forever, things like the Earth's orbit, its wobble, its tilt, solar activity, reflectivity, they get that bright blue line, which shows what would be happening if nature was left, again, to her own devices. And you can see we would be in a slight cooling period. But when scientists add in human activity on top of the natural activity, they get the bright green line. And look how closely that approximates the orange line, what has actually happened and been observed. So scientists cannot explain what is happening without factoring in our activity. And if you consider that without our activity, we would actually be in a cooling period, it is reasonable to say that man is responsible for 100% of this heating. So hopefully you're with me that climate change is real and that it is being precipitated by our activities. Let's move to that third question. What do the scientists think? And this is a critical gateway question because very few Americans understand how strong the consensus is. In fact, the consensus is as strong as our understanding that smoking leads to more incidence of lung cancer, something that probably all of us on the Zoom call would agree is true. So we know lots of numbers are bandied about out there. We decided to go to a source that we found very credible, and that is NASA. And on their website, they say 97% or more of climate scientists say climate change is happening, man influence, and poses a threat. Now, you really don't get that kind of consensus in science very often. But perhaps you're someone who doesn't believe in individual scientists. So let's take a look at what some of the more prestigious associations say. Perhaps you would agree with me that the National Academies of Sciences are some of the more prestigious organizations. Well, 15 years ago, when George W. Bush was president, and clearly there was no pressure on scientists to say that climate change was happening, all of the National Academies of Sciences from the major leading countries of the world came together and issued a warning. And they wrote, "The scientific understanding of climate change is now sufficiently clear to justify nations taking prompt action." 15 years ago. And if you don't believe the National Academies of Sciences, I ask you to look up any prestigious scientific association that you find credible. I did for all of these, many more, and it was universal. Climate change is happening and poses a real threat ahead. And if you don't believe in the scientific institutions, take a look at what the fossil fuel companies are saying now. ExxonMobil, the risk of climate change is clear and warrants action. Shell, we recognize the significance of climate change. A key role for Shell is to find ways to provide much more energy with less carbon dioxide. And even the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is made up of the CEOs of all the top oil companies, say they are committed to support the Paris Agreement goals and recognize the urgency to address climate change. So we kind of have to step back and say, if the CEOs of Saudi Aramco and Exxon and Shell and BP and Chevron all agree that climate change is happening, what are the rest of us arguing about? So I'd like you guys to step back for a minute and think about how you normally assess risk in your own life. If you're like most of us, we break that risk evaluation into three parts. The first part is, how likely is it to happen? Well, we just saw the Arctic Ocean melting with our own eyes, and we just saw that NASA says that 97% or more of the experts say it is. So I think we can check that box. The second part of that equation normally is, so what are the consequences if they come to pass? Are they things that we can really live with and deal with if they happen? Or are they things that we really want to try to avoid? And then the third part of that risk assessment normally is, okay, so how difficult or expensive is it to avoid those risks? I hope you agree. So if we're going to follow this, we are now going to move into evaluating that second part. What are the consequences? How dangerous is it? And are we comfortable taking that risk? And to do that, we need to move to our fourth question: is it dangerous? Now, I'd like to take a moment to orient you on this slide. It is what I think is the most important slide in the entire presentation. And that's because it shows the big picture. If you take a look at the bottom axis, we have time going back 20,000 years. And then on the y-axis, we have temperature in Fahrenheit. So it's quick and easy for us to read. About 11 degrees hotter to about 9 degrees colder. The yellow line is average global temperature, and the white are kind of milestones put on top just for reference points. So as we can see, 20,000 years ago, we were in the middle of the last ice age. There was over half a mile of ice on top of Manhattan, and the southernmost glacier ended at exit 9 on the turnpike, just north of Princeton. It was obviously a very different planet, and much of it was uninhabitable. And then over about 8,000 or 9,000 years, the temperature moderated and came up to what more or less has been the average global temperature for the last 10,000 years, which is around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a really nice temperature for our species and a temperature the Earth hasn't been at very often in its long history. When we arrived at that 60 degrees Fahrenheit, we stopped being nomads and were able to settle down and farm. You can see soon after that little bump, we had the flourishing of the Mesopotamian civilization. This little hill was the medieval warming period where the Vikings were able to grow vegetables in Greenland. And then you see the deep divot, that perhaps a full degree or more, which was the little ice age where there was such deprivation and food shortage and upheaval. Again, a small change in global average temperature making for a big change on how people experience life. And then you see the temperature goes up, up and away, landing somewhere between 3.6 and 10.8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter by the end of this century. So let's think about that. I know a lot of you are gardeners. We had almost 8,000 or 9,000 years for nature to moderate, to literally march trees from Mexico to Montana to create the ecosystems and the biodiversity that we have depended on for the last 10,000 years. And now, through our activities, we are potentially triggering the same delta in 100 years. That's scary, right? And that is what brought all of the countries of the world together to say, we can't go there. We have to stay at the low levels. We have to stay at the 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which correlates to a 2 degrees Celsius that we hear about so much in the press, or even better at a 1.5 degrees Celsius, because at those levels, we think we can mitigate, we can adapt, and we can be okay. But above that, we're just not so sure. So let's take a minute to delve into what some of these changes are to our ecosystems and natural services. But before we do so, I'd like you to consider these changes through 3 specific lenses. The first one is, how will these changes impact the economy and jobs in your area? The second is, how will they impact your and your family's health and personal security? And the third is, how will they impact your exposure to geopolitical instability, which we experience as exposure to civil conflict, refugee crisis, and even terrorism? So I'd like you to take a minute and ask yourself why I'm asking you to think about climate changes through those specific lenses. Because those are the 3 things that Americans say are most important to them when they go to vote. And we believe that all 3 will be profoundly and negatively impacted by climate change. So let's see if you agree. The first change I'd like to focus on is global temperature. This graphic from NASA shows us how the average temperature has changed from 1890 up to current times. When it is blue, it is colder than average. When it is white, it is average. When it is yellow, it is warmer. And when it is red, it is hotter. So as you can see at the end, that red really came crescendoing in. And that's because we aren't just breaking records, we are shattering them. As you can see, the 10 hottest years on record have all been since 2009, and the 5 hottest years have been the last 5 years. And I think many of you might have seen the press that said they think we have broken the hottest day ever recorded just this last month, with 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And guys, I'm really sorry, my dog just came in and he's probably making a lot of noise. Sorry about that. So that's what's happening today. Let's take a look at what's happening to some of our friends down under who had to add the color purple to their national heat map because they are routinely forecasting temperatures above 125 degrees Fahrenheit. So what does 125 degrees Fahrenheit feels like? Well, a reporter in Baghdad wrote a story just last month about what it felt like to her. And she relates how she put her hand on a doorknob and it came back blistered. And when she opened her suitcase, some of her clothing had melted inside. So it's really not something that we've ever experienced before. So what does it mean for us in the future? Well, Climate Central, which is a nonpartisan group, took 26 different climate models and averaged them together to see what our summers in New York could be like if we continue on our current emissions path. And you can see that they forecast that it will be about 9.5 degrees hotter and feel like a summer in southern Florida. But it's not just the heat we have to worry about, it's the combination of heat and humidity. One of the things that Climate Central also evaluates are things called danger days, when the heat index, which is the heat and humidity, feels like above 105 degrees. And the reason why it's called a danger day is because at that point, it becomes very difficult for our bodies to sweat and cool ourselves down and keep us safe. Municipalities have to create cooling centers. We hear on the radio, don't go outside for work or for recreation. They're kind of lost days. We don't have many of those in New York today, but in the near future, it's projected that we will have quite a few more, almost half a month in the next 12 years or 10 years, and almost a full month by mid-century. But it's even more sobering when we look to some of our favorite cities down south, cities like Naples and Tampa Houston, and New Orleans, who are projected to have many months of danger days by the middle and later part of the century. So let's think about those three lenses. What do you think is going to happen to those cities' jobs and economy when many months of the year it is really dangerous to be outside? Well, we know that productivity goes down as heat goes up. We know that they will need to build more infrastructure to keep people safe. We know that infrastructure buckles more in the heat, so it will be more costly. And we also know that agricultural yield goes down as heat goes up. We also know that transportation is impacted and flights are grounded. So clear hits to their jobs and economy. What about that second lens, health and personal security? Well, crime goes up as heat goes up. Heat exacerbates lung and heart disease. But what many of us may not realize that heat is also the #1 weather killer, more than any other weather occurrence. So clear hits to personal health and security. What about that third lens, geopolitical instability? What could the scientists mean about that? Well, scientists warned that as hot as our southern states may be, it will be hotter in parts of Central America and down into South America. And many people there will find their lands much less habitable. And they envision migrations and refugee flows unlike anything we've ever seen. In fact, scientists also envision migration within our own country as people from southern states move up to the north. So clear hits to all three lenses just on the topic of heat. But of course, heat isn't just in our country, it's all around the world. This is a graphic from NASA that shows that if we continue on our current emissions path, they project that average temperatures in some of these highly populated areas will average above 113 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's think about that. If the Syrian refugee crisis was caused by 5 million people being displaced because of civil war, what sort of migration and refugee crisis will Europe and other parts of the North experience when so many people in these highly populated areas find that their land is so much less habitable? It's a real concern. And perhaps one of the things that I have found most sobering is that this year a study came out that showed in bits of the world, for tiny bits of time, our temperatures are already reaching a point where a human being sitting under a tree doing nothing will be overwhelmed by the heat if it continues on for longer periods. It is getting hotter than humans have ever experienced before, and scientists project that this will rapidly become true in many more places and for longer durations. Let's move off of heat quickly to food. This is from the World Resource Institute, which shows where crop yield will decrease when we increase to a 3 degrees Celsius increase, and you can see that in red. A few areas, especially Canada and maybe Northern Europe and Russia, actually increase their crop yield. But if you go up to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, there's no green left on this map. And food isn't just on land, it's also in the oceans. One of the things that many of us may not know is that when carbon dioxide mixes with ocean water, it turns into carbonic acid and actually changes the pH of our oceans. And this is really, really bad news for tiny or any creature that makes its shell out of calcium, including these tiny little preteropods or sea butterflies, which are at the base of the marine food chain for many fish that we depend on, like mackerel and salmon. Scientists have discovered that these types of creatures are already being harmed by the acidity of the water today. And little creatures like the sea butterflies actually melt totally away when they are put into water as acidic as is projected by century's end. But we're not just acidifying the ocean, we're also heating it up. As this graphic shows, in some areas it's over 4 degrees hotter. And this is leading to all sorts of changes in our hurricane patterns. They are forming where they used to not form, they are going where they used to not go, they are intensifying, and they are moving more slowly. So that it makes sense, because if you think about it, hurricanes are nature's way of cooling down her oceans. So it's not surprising we're seeing more powerful ones and that the patterns are indeed changing. But the heat isn't just hampering or leading to our more hurricanes, it is also harming our coral reefs and leading to these massive bleaching events. Now, coral reefs are the nurseries for about 25% of all marine sea life. So clearly, our actions are hampering future generations' ability to feed themselves from the sea. Now, remember when I said small numbers matter? This is a great time to drill down on that. In the most recent International Panel of Climate Change report, they came out and said that if we could keep our temperature increase to that 1.5 degree change, that perhaps 10 to 30% of our coral reefs could survive. But if we go to that 2 degrees Celsius increase, they anticipate we will lose them all. So every smidgen of a degree is worth fighting for. Let's stay on water, and you guys can guess where this heavy rainstorm caused this flood. It could be anywhere in the United States, and that's simply due to the laws of physics. Warmer air holds more water vapor. So every degree Celsius increase, scientists believe it holds 7% more water vapor, which means that in these heavy rain incidents, there's more water to come crashing down on our heads. And you can see that it's increasing all across the country, but that the Northeast, and of course the New York region, has seen the the largest changes in heavy precipitation, excuse me. And as we have more rain, we are getting less snow. Precipitation is falling longer into the year as rain. Our snowpacks are smaller and they're melting earlier. And this has really important ramifications for farms and towns that are downstream that are dependent on that snow melt during the hot growing season. Let's talk quickly about sea level rise. We have had about 8 inches of sea level rise so far. And we know that we baked a lot more in. We just don't know how fast it's going to come. And the reason we know we baked it in is because we can see that the land ice is melting. Remember that Alaskan glacier that we saw. And we know that the oceans are warming, which means that they are thermally expanding. The scientists know that we have baked in a fair amount of sea level rise. They just don't know how much will hit us by the end of the century. The best case scenario is somewhere between 1.5 and 3 feet. The worst case that NOAA came out with was more like 8 feet, depending on how unstable some of the ice shelves in Antarctica and Greenland are, and they are looking pretty unstable. If it comes slowly enough, we'll have time to react. If it comes too quickly, it will have incredible economic ramifications. According to Zillow, which is not a green organization, we have about $80 or $900 billion worth of properties that would be underwater at a 6-foot sea level rise. And clearly, Florida has the most to lose, but New Jersey ranks number 2 with $93 billion exposure. And to kind of envision what that might mean, that would mean that in Boston, about 18% of their real estate would be lost. And again, that's what's underwater. That isn't what is impacted by storm surge or normal tide activity. And in Miami, it would be more like 31%. But it's not just our cities, it's also our roads and our airports and our railroads and even our fiber optics. In fact, there have been studies that show that it could be somewhere between 2 to 5 trillion to rebuild all of that if the sea levels come too quickly. So real hits to our economy ahead. And if you're someone who says, I don't believe in projections, take a look what we can see with our own eyes right now up and down our coastline. And that is sunny day nuisance flooding, where towns and cities up and down our coast are flooding simply due to high tide and sea level rise. And it doesn't look so drastic, but it has real ramifications for the shops and the people who live in these towns. And this is at 8 inches. Imagine what it would be like at 1.5 or 3 feet, or even 6 feet. Let's quickly move to health. This is from the Centers for Disease Control, which is very robust in their website about all the different things. And I think a lot of it are things that you would anticipate. But one of the ones that kind of shocked me was asthma. And in fact, climate change will have a real negative impact on our asthma rates because it increases pollen levels, which are triggers for asthma. You can see it's expected to really more than double as we go into the latter part of the century. And for you gardeners out there, yes, poison ivy is more aggressive and it is stronger right now and more toxic and is expected to continue to become so as we get later into the century, again, because it thrives with the increased carbon dioxide. And clearly with this year, we recognize that wildfire season has changed. I think this slide is really out of date because they're kind of saying that wildfire season is the entire year now. And of course, human management of the forest plays an important role. But scientists say that the fact that summer-like conditions extend further through the year means that when that spark hits, it's so much easier to become a conflagration and to spread quickly and be more dangerous. Another thing that the CDC says is that we are experiencing more diseases because of climate change, because disease vectors like ticks and fleas and mosquitoes are spreading out and having a bigger geographical footprint and are active longer in the season. In fact, you can see that since 1980 to 2014, there are 15 more days when we can be bitten by mosquitoes in the New York City area. Now that doesn't sound like so much, but the CDC also says that the numbers of diseases from these disease vectors have tripled between 2004 and 2015, and 8 new germs have been introduced. And diseases like Chagas and Zika and dengue, which we really didn't see much in our country, have now infiltrated in the South and will continue to move north. The CDC also talks about the fact that climate change will cause mass population movement and international conflict. So what do we think the CDC means about that? Well, what they mean is that when you put these pressures on places with poor governance and weak institution, it can lead to chaos, which is exactly what our own US Department of Defense wrote in 2016 in their report to Congress. Climate change is an urgent and growing threat to our national security, contributing to increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources such as food and water. These impacts are already occurring, and the scope, scale, and intensity of these impacts are projected to increase over time. And I would be remiss if I didn't speak to the loss of biodiversity and ecosystems. I'm sure many of you may be birders and have seen the recent Audubon Society campaign that says 2/3 of all North American birds are threatened by climate change. But it's not just the animals, it's also our plants. This is a beautiful reservoir down by me where I love to walk my dog, and I hope that one day when I have a grandchild, I can bring them there and they can see the beauty of the fall splendor. But scientists say that when my grandchild grows up, these trees may no longer be in Princeton because they are moving north because they need the cold to flourish. And this is happening all around the world where we are losing our iconic and special spaces. And I don't really know how to put a price tag on that. In fact, to me, I think it's kind of priceless. But people are putting a price tag on what's coming. This is directly from the BlackRock Institute, and it shows where they project GDP loss due to climate change by 2060. Only the areas of green are projected to show GDP gain. Everything else in orange or deeper orange shows loss. So I'm sure I have depressed you because I've taken you through quite a lot of dangers, especially what could happen if we continue on our current path. We shared with you projections from groups like NASA and NOAA, who we normally look to keep us safe. But it doesn't mean the projections are spot on. They are still built on assumptions and models. But the question isn't whether we are 100% sure that they are correct. The question is, are they credible? Because anywhere else in our lives, when we would face a credible threat where the consequences are this dire, we would take action to avoid that threat. Think about whether you have fire insurance for your own home. I'm sure you do. And that's not because you're 100% sure that your house is going to catch on fire, but that if it does, it would be catastrophic. And so you do the smart things. You have fire doors, you're careful with your fires, you buy smart appliances, and you have fire insurance. Scientists say that the chances of climate change negatively impacting every single one of us on this call is much greater than the chances of our houses burning down. But we are not according it the same respect as we would other risks. Now, I know there are pundits who say, hey, don't get sucked in, don't get alarmed. Those models are way overstating the risk. But what we don't hear as much about is on the other side of the equation, the scientists who are saying, actually, the models are understating the risk because they aren't capturing the black swan events, things that are less likely to happen, but truly catastrophic if they do. Like what? Like the melting of the Arctic permafrost. I think we all know that when organisms die up in the Arctic, sometimes they freeze before they fully decay. Now, as the Arctic is warming, they are decaying en masse and putting up high quantities of CO2 and methane up into the air. And scientists worry it could create a feedback loop that humans could never control. So we have those on one side who say, hey, don't worry, be happy. We have those on the other side saying, drink heavily, the Titanic is going down. And then we have the vast majority of scientists in the middle who say this is a serious risk, but there are smart things that we can do to lessen that risk. And we're all supposed to make a bet. And that bet isn't just for us, but it's for everyone else on the planet. And it's not just for our generation, but for future generations to come. What would a prudent person do? How should we make that bet? Okay, hang on, because we're moving into section number 5, which is there hope? And I will promise you that we believe 100% loudly and strongly that there is. And the reason that we believe there is hope is because the economic equation around this issue has been turned on its head. The cost of inaction now is recognized as being much greater than the cost of action. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that the old equation was climate change is going to happen to far off places and far off times. And what we need to do is protect our current economy and not harm it in any way by something that's a future occurrence. The new equation is we as taxpayers are paying for climate change today out of our own pockets. And the ability to move and lessen our risk has dropped and become so much more easy. So what do I mean by that? Well, we're paying to repair and prepare for climate change, to repair from all the natural disasters that are striking us. And I don't think anyone on this call has not noticed that they are accelerating in their number and they are becoming more expensive. This is from Munich Re, a reinsurance company, and it shows it on these bar charts that climate change is exacerbating. It's loading the dice or stacking the deck.
This is a reminder. Do the end.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen.
Survey.
And we're also planning to prepare for climate change. How? By building things like the $14 by $5 million
survey.
The joys of sharing a house with your son.
Reminder.
Sorry.
Put out the recycling.
Did you hear that I have to put out the recycling? Okay.
This is a reminder. Put out the recycling.
I apologize. So we have the $14.5 billion wall in southern Louisiana to protect the city of New Orleans. We have Ike's Dike that has been proposed for Texas, which is $60 billion. We have $3.2 billion that's being spent in Miami to raise its roads and increase its drainage. And New York City was considering a $120 billion seawall to protect its harbor areas. So real dollars that we are forced to consider to protect ourselves from what climate change is bringing. And at the same time we are paying for climate change, we are also recognizing that the ability to move to low carbon fuel sources has become economically viable. Take a look at this chart from Lazard, which shows that today, in over 2/3 of the world, the cheapest new form of energy, power energy, is solar, followed by wind, followed by gas, which is much more expensive, and then coal and nuclear. This is a game changer and something that no one would have envisioned 10 years ago. In fact, it has enabled us to project that we could create over 80% of all of our total electricity that we need by 2050 through solar and wind and renewables and nuclear alone. In fact, in 2019, for the first time, the United States got more of its energy from renewables than from coal. And intriguingly, in Europe, they got more of their energy from renewables than all fossil fuel sources combined. And this is leading to all sorts of job growth. As you can see from this graphic, almost 3/4 of all jobs in the power generation sector are now in non-fossil fuels. Again, a game changer. And other countries are leading the way. You can see from this graphic that developing countries are outspending us on renewable technology. And even China, who we consider as kind of the greatest emitter and who clearly has a very poor environmental record, is actually outspending us tremendously because they have stated they want to be the singular superpower in the new low carbon economy. And you can see they're outspending us almost 2 to 1, and they have 76% of the patents in this area. And it's not that we don't know what to do. We know the policies that work, and there are those that fit a more conservative perspective all the way over to a liberal perspective. What we haven't had is the political will and the public consensus to put the puzzle pieces together. And our choice is stark. We can either turn and pivot to the fuels of the future or continue to support the fuels of the past. Other countries are pivoting and are taking advantage and leads in some of this new technology. And a question that was once asked was, or commented on, was we didn't leave the Stone Age because we ran out of stones, but because we found something better. And while at our own federal level, we are somewhat dithering, states, universities, and cities are moving ahead and taking the lead. And they're doing it because they know that climate change will impact their own entities. As General Mills says on their policy of climate, they are worried not only about being able to deliver their food, but also to be able to provide the value to their shareholders. And it's not just General Mills, but all of the major corporations who are committing to decarbonization and pushing it down through their supply chains. They're leading the way. And we know what we need to do. We need more R&D, more investment, more innovation, things that all Americans can agree on. And we know that great wealth will be created from those who provide the disruptions and provide the new technologies. We need to be more efficient in how we use energy. It's a low-hanging fruit. It's a way that we can save money while reducing our emissions. We need to modernize our grid. Our current grid system is kind of like our old road system before Eisenhower's built the highways. We need to create the highway system of power. And in doing so, we can then use the new technologies, things that would enable us to integrate storage and use demand and response. So I put this cute little Tesla battery up on this picture because this is a real interesting way forward. The experts say that if we have batteries, whether in our electric car or hanging on our wall, that utilities could borrow a little bit of energy from each of us when they hit a peak usage period, instead of having to build and use a peaking plant that is powered by fossil fuels. And once we have that cleaner or bigger, better grid, we have to decarbonize it. We have to electrify everything from our transportation, our garbage trucks, our buses, and yes, even airplanes, and also use electricity to heat and cool our homes. But we're going to continue to use fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. And in order to do so, we need to find ways to use it safely. Carbon capture shows some promise. This is a plant up in Iceland that actually captures the gas and puts it underground where it turns back into rock. This is a negative emissions plant in Switzerland that actually sucks carbon out of the air and then sells it to a nearby Coca-Cola plant to put fizz in soda. And there are all sorts of interesting things that can be made from the carbon we pull out of the air, things like fish food and plastics. But the one that I thought was perhaps most whimsical is vodka. Yes, they can make vodka from carbon. And there's quite a lot of promise in the new nuclear. Our military is moving ahead with new forms of nuclear, and other countries are building them, but there has been progress just this last month here in our country. And these new smaller reactors are much safer. They shut down on the principles of physics instead of needing human intervention. Many of them use salt instead of water, and some of them use thorium instead of uranium. And there is quite a lot of hope that if we can get them safer with much less waste, they will play an important role over the midterm. Two other forms of energy are showing great promise: fusion and green hydrogen. They have always been out of reach, but new breakthroughs in other attendant technologies are bringing them tantalizingly close. And they're both kind of the holy grail of energy in that they're very clean and can be used across multiple applications. But innovation isn't just in labs, it's also in how we treat nature. And we know that if we use different land use practices and different agricultural practices, we could capture almost 30% of the excess carbon in the air. But we're in a race, and right now we are losing that race. As you can see from this graphic, we are currently on about a 6 to 10 degree increase at the end of this century on our current emissions path. Now let's think about that. At 7 degrees colder, we were in the middle of an ice age. What do we think it will be like at 7 degrees hotter for our kids and our grandkids at the end of this century? We don't want to find out. And in order to avoid that, we need to come together. We need to have our technology and scientists and engineering experts come together with our entrepreneurs, our financiers, our investors, our corporations. We need public support, and we need smart policy to lay down the rules of the road, similarly to how we embrace the fight for World War II. And the fascinating thing is those top four areas are moving. There is so much happening there. Where we are falling down is on public understanding and policy support, things that all of us on this call can impact. So what do we need to do? We need to care. We need to think about this every single day and realize that when we meet a kid or a small child in a stroller and they grow up, they are going to ask us, what did we do? Did we stand by, or did we take action? We need to get energized. We cannot get overcome by the enormity of this topic, because if you think about the fact that if a foreign country was coming in to take as much land as we are about to lose to sea level rise and constant drought, we would be at war. We would be acting. We can't be intimidated. Only a very small portion, somewhere between 9 and 14% of Americans do not believe in climate change, yet they have an outsized control of our policy. We need to raise our voices. We need to influence our policy leaders, whatever side of the aisle they sit on. Republicans have embraced climate change. Kevin McCarthy has said that the Republicans need to come forward with a very strong plan because young Republicans care deeply about this issue. And Democrats need to have the ability to forge the consensus and pull people along, because they have been elected more on solving short-term problems than long-term ones. And this is a difficult one to solve. So we need to support them as they come together to make some tough decisions. We need to vote, and we need to take personal action. Calling your policy leaders is the most important thing we can do. When they get 100 calls, they consider it a tsunami. We need to use our voices. We need to also use our voices with those who disagree or do not understand the risks of climate change, because again, we need to build that public awareness and consensus. And learning from someone you know, like, and trust is the one way that people change their minds. We need to figure out our own carbon footprint. There are many ways of doing that online, and then consider buying an offset for your carbon usage. We need to schedule energy audits and making our homes more energy efficient. Consider eating more leftovers. Over 40% of our food is thrown out, and the waste and energy that is wasted for that is something that we can all impact. We need to educate ourselves more, and not just by listening to the pundits who are paid to enrage and engage us, but looking to the scientists and to the financial experts, because it is clear, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, all of them are coming out with reports saying that we have to understand this risk and we have to take action. Sign up for green energy from your utility, and don't forget to support the many not-for-profits who are active in this arena. There are those that are more conservative and those that are more liberal, but they are doing incredibly important work. So scientists say that we are the first generation to understand the risks of climate change. And we are really the last generation that can do anything to avoid the brunt of it from falling on our kids and our grandkids. And a question for all of us on this Zoom call and all of us on this planet is, what will we choose to do? Thank you, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. That was really enlightening and very thorough. And I think that your optimism and ideas of what we can do is very powerful, because it's very easy to be overwhelmed by negative news about this and fears about it. So
Thank you.
we have a question here, is what is the IPL green power option?
So independent power sources. So normally in about 60% of the country, your utility will offer you the ability to buy green power through a third-party provider. It is still distributed by your utility. They're still responsible for delivering it to you for your poles, your wires, and all your customer service. It simply means that when you buy that green energy is put onto the grid for usage. It doesn't mean that you are getting that green energy. It means it is blending down the energy on the grid, and you are responsible for that improvement to the grid and for preventing those emissions from going up in the atmosphere. Is that clear? Does that make sense? So you can sign up usually through your utility, or else I get letters for it all the time. One of the things that our community in Princeton just did was buy an aggregate green energy purchase, so that every homeowner in Princeton could have access to green energy at a price that was lower than what they were paying to our utility because of the aggregation. But you, of course, could opt out, but it was a wonderful way of really lowering our entire town's footprint.
I just want to say that people can unmute themselves now to ask questions if they didn't do it in the chat. And Kathleen, I don't know if you want to change the screen from what will we do to so that we can see people, or there's our website, that's important too.
Is there a
I
website?
think having the list of what can we do, which was the second to last slide, might be helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
says this was more the emotional and then this was more the specific.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can I just share with you guys that like literally not seeing anybody and talking into your screen is so, you feel so alone.
We're here. We're here.
Is anyone out there listening? Like, oh my goodness.
Right.
Yes. Yes, we are. If everybody wants to share their screens, then Kathleen can see you. I did have one question that I just don't know if people were thinking of, is like, why is New Jersey particularly going to be hotter and wetter than elsewhere in the nation? And why is sea level rise predicted to be higher here than anywhere else on the eastern coast?
Well, I didn't say hotter and wetter. It is, we are in the Northeast, so we are getting more of those heavy rainfall occurrences. And sea level rise is high in New Jersey. And it's high for a couple of reasons. So one of the reasons is because those glaciers, and probably, Kathy, you probably know this better than I do, but one of the reasons is the fact that the glaciers ended here in New Jersey, and literally that weight had suppressed, when it was seeded, actually has led to our land beginning to subside. Another thing is that we're using up our water resources, which means that we're sucking the water and the soils are compressing. Another thing that is fascinating to me is that we are kind of in a race, because if Antarctica melts before Greenland, the opposite one, gravitational pull, will pull the melting water towards it. So that means that if Antarctica melts before Greenland, we will have higher sea level rise than in the southern hemisphere. So it's all very complicated. But the sea level rise numbers that I gave you were average ones. They weren't specifically to New Jersey. When I said 1.5 to 3 or NOAA's high level of 8, that was average.
Yeah, it's all connected. I mean, I had never really heard that about the different ice shields, you know, melting. Like if Antarctica melts first, it would cause more sea level rise in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah, it's the gravitational pull of the other one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other?
Hi, I was wondering if there's a way I could be more involved with your meetings. Do you have, this is my first time joining one of my school clubs. It's an ecology club. They told me that there was a meeting today, and I was wondering if there's like more meetings like this hosted by you, or similar people, like monthly meetings, or where I could find something like this, because I'm really interested in this and I would love to be more active.
Well, there are lots of groups that are involved, and I'm sure there are groups up by you, but why don't you give Margaret your email and we'll get in touch with you. We do give these presentations by Zoom now, but we give them around the country. We are also working on giving them at schools. So that would be kind of an interesting thing that you could maybe help us a little bit, because it sounds like that's exactly where you are. And then we could also give you some ideas of other groups that might be active up in your area. So if you, Margaret, can you get her contact information? We'll reach back.
I can get it out of the chat. Yes, thanks.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? Because if not, I have something you said I'm optimistic. So I just want to share something I just heard today and I was so excited. I know this is really kind of nerdy. So one of the things that just happened last week is that the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which sounds really dry, issued a report where they evaluated the risk of climate change to our financial systems. And it was made up of stakeholders from across the platform, from environmentalists to oil companies to banks to investors, the whole bit. And they all agreed that climate change was a clear and present danger to our financial system if we let it continue and run amok. And what was so fascinating about this is that all these groups came together and were mandating then that government needs to take action to provide the regulations and the transparency to keep investors safe as we go forward. So it's a it's a voice that has been whispering, but came out in a really loud and full-throated way. And I was really excited by this because it just shows the momentum that is happening within the financial and business sectors that will be responsible for driving a lot of these changes. So I was even happier about this after sitting in on that conference call today.
Kathleen, do you want to say anything about wildfires? Because having my son's in California and Northern California, Southern California, the air quality is just untenable. And we've talked about wildfires, but it's so top of mind today.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think that we sometimes forget that, wildfires are so deadly for the people right there, but the air quality is compromised several states over, right? It's really affecting an extremely large portion of our country. And it's frightening because the types of environmental causes were expected. And it's not like this is a one-off, a terrible year, and it won't happen like this again in the future. We know how to mitigate some of it through our own activities, but the fact that we are continuing to warm up the earth and create drier soils and drier trees, and the fact that pests that used to be stopped by winter weather are able to decimate forests that used to be healthy and then turn them into really fire kindling, all are due to climate change. And so it is a clear wake-up call, just as I won't say Hurricane Laura because they haven't discerned whether that is attributable to climate change, but stronger hurricanes are. And we are seeing them, and again, seeing these billion-dollar events happen much more frequently. And it's only going to get worse. This is after, just as we said, 2-degree Fahrenheit increase. We know it's going to get worse if we don't take action. So we need to act quickly and come together.
Thank
Kathleen, where can our efforts have the biggest or the most immediate impact, and realizing that both of those things may not be the same? Should we be concentrating at the state level or the municipal level? Because it certainly seems that it takes forever to get anything done federally.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Our city has done, or our town of Princeton has done an amazing job. They did an entire study and created a plan, a climate change plan, and talked to all the stakeholders, and has really moved forward with good policy. And again, I guess one of the things that I think we don't realize well enough is that policy sets the rules of the road. You can have great ideas, you can have great innovation, but if they don't work together, or they cancel each other out, or you put in all of your solar fields all together instead of distributed around the country, it won't get us where we need to go. So we need smart policy, and that can be set at the states, and a lot of states are doing great jobs. I think New Jersey is doing a very good job. Kathy, do you agree with that? I don't know. You work for the state. You can't. Never mind.
I do. No, but I think they're one of the first states in the nation to create a climate report and to be proactive. Yeah. So that's with my not work hat on. That's me.
New York has done an amazing job, I think, in what they've done as well. And I think there's learning to be learned or gained from seeing what states are doing in a smart way. I think New Jersey's doing a pretty good job there. So I guess I would focus on your municipality, and I would also focus on companies and influencing them, whether you are a customer or an investor or an employee, because I think companies are driving the change at this point much more than at the federal level. Also, one other thing I will say is individual action doesn't make too much of a dent because we're just one little individual, but there's something called behavioral contagion. So if people see you doing something, whether it's buying an electric car or whether it's putting up solar panels or eating less meat. If you talk about it, it's really interesting because it is much more likely to influence those around you. And so even though individual actions don't seem like much, they actually do really build into a much greater influence than we recognize.
Kathleen, can you stop sharing your screen so then people can see you more and see each other? Thank you.
There you. Thank you, Margaret. Good idea. So for individual action, one of the best things you can do is buy an electric car. And I just want to say that electric cars are really much more fun to drive. They're much more quiet. You plug them in at night like you do your cell phone. And they believe that by 2025, they will be really cheaper than a combustion engine, because if you think about it, they really are just computers on wheels, and there are fewer parts to break down and fewer components to build. So if you're thinking about something that you can do personally, I really recommend thinking about that for one of your cars or your next car.
I can interject here and say that the state has provided incentives to go electric and had provided a grant program for localities, and Mount Tabor did apply for a grant and is getting electrical ports put in the main parking lot over the next year, so that people will be able to park and charge their electric vehicles in town. Kathleen, you don't know, we live in really tiny houses jammed together, and we park in a remote parking lot. A lot of us park in a remote parking lot, and that's where those charging stations are going to be. So that's one move that Mount Tabor is making, and I don't know if Parsippany, Greater Parsippany, maybe somebody else knows more about that.
I think someone has a question. They've Sam. We don't know your name. It's Samsung. Someone has raised the hand. Can you identify yourself and ask the question, please?
Maybe they're muted.
They are.
Yeah.
I don't know. They have to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Now we
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay,
Yes.
good. I'm Larry Yellen. I've been on the call, but I haven't been on the screen. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
I have several observations and several questions about what we've been talking about. I see this as a worldwide problem, not just the United States. And I don't see cooperation between nations. And the two things that I'm looking at is China and the Amazon, and the destruction that both of them, well, that China has done actually in the Amazon, but what China is doing to the world. And I'm wondering who is monitoring this.
Okay, so it is absolutely an international issue. And what I heard today on this call, again, from the financial experts, was that the fact that the United States wasn't leading was a real problem. What I will say about China is they are schizophrenic. They are both spending on coal plants and in their exports to countries all around, especially in Africa. They are supporting fossil fuel development. At the same time, they are at the forefront of the new technologies, whether it's nuclear, even in fusion, in electrification, in mass transit. They are kind of the stars. So they are both evil and good, if you can imagine that. The COVID crisis has set them back a bit, and they are using coal as economic development to bring their economy back. And that's a real loss, because they were doing better internally up until this year. So it'll be intriguing to watch. Some of the developing countries, and I can't say the Amazon is more about deforestation and land use, but a lot of the developing countries are finding that solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuels, and they don't need to build the same sort of expensive infrastructure. So it's almost like when they jump to cell phones instead of going to regular landlines, there's hope that some parts of the developing world could do that. The Amazon is a huge problem. Our land usage is a huge problem. There are some countries that are replanting. Russia is doing a lot of replanting. China's done a lot of replanting. I don't think that it's enough to counterbalance what's happening in the Amazon. Again, policy. You need to be able to give people a financial reward for doing the right thing instead of for them having the financial reward for doing the wrong thing, which means that we really need a price on carbon, and we need an international price on carbon.
That's part of it. The other part of it is the Amazon is where we get most of our oxygen from. And China has been buying a lot of land, burning it, leveling it, taking everything out of it. And they're, as well as what they're doing in their country, if you go into some of their major cities, you can't breathe the air. They all wear masks. I was in the textile industry. They use dyes over there, which are all carcinogens. So we couldn't import the fabrics to use them. They're very pretty, but they don't care. As long as they're selling or they can make $1 at it, that's what they're doing. And my question goes back to, who is monitoring this? It's not the United Nations. Who is it?
Well, there are different agencies that are responsible for it. If you're talking about the air pollution, the United States was the first one, and I think it was our embassies were the first one to start measuring how dirty their air was. Right now, I don't know that there's one entity. There are groups within the United Nations that monitor all emissions from all countries. And that's another way that we know climate change is happening, because we know how many tons of carbon each country puts up by what they burn. I don't know that anyone can tell China not to do what they're doing, and I think they are doing things that are very harmful. If there was more consensus through the world, we might be in a different, we might be able to bend it. And if there was a penalty on Chinese products that were using carbon in a way that was harmful, by having a price on carbon that was international, that could have an effect.
No, I totally agree with you. The other thing is an observation. 8 years ago, I went up to Montreal with my wife on a extended vacation, which was beautiful. Driving from the airport into downtown, the entire length on both sides had solar power. They had huge panels. And I don't know why every major city and every major highway in the United States doesn't have this, which would solve a lot of our problems, because wind power kills birds and it makes a lot of noise. It's not all that wonderful, and it is expensive to run. Those turbines are a fortune. But solar paneling is very efficient, and it would cut everything down, and it doesn't have the risk of atomic energy.
So I think you raised a good point. There's a lot of growth, especially in utility solar. There's been a little less on some of the rooftops, and in part because that is impacted a lot at the state level, and we haven't had a really strong national policy. So solar has a lot of room to grow. Could you take up a much bigger portion of our current energy needs. I think you sell wind a little short. I think offshore wind has great promise, and also wind in some places like Texas, which is the wind capital of our country, in some hard scrabble places where the farms are failing and communities are going under. Wind has kept those farming communities alive, and has made Texas one of the, they were the #1 or #2 wind provider in our country, and it's huge. So I don't think any source of energy doesn't come with some problems. The problem is that fossil fuel comes with one that's truly catastrophic. There are some things that I know wind is doing. One of the things they're trying to do is paint one of the blades black, and it's showing that the birds can somehow see that. I don't understand how that works, but I was happy to read it. But I think what we need is a real combination of wind, of solar, of batteries, of biofuels, and we need to have more efficiency. Other countries are doing it. And water also.
Yeah, water power also with the ocean, with the waves back and forth. That's an untapped area too.
Absolutely. And our hydro and our dams are still playing important parts. So all of that is renewable.
Agree. Thank you.
Thank you. So any other questions, anyone? Because we're happy to, if you think of one, you can send it to our website. We are always looking for opportunities to share this with churches or schools or other groups. We have some people who are trained up. We have some others presenting this. So if you guys have friends you want to mention this to or share or recommend us to, we'd really appreciate it.
And we are planning to follow up by email because you've all signed up with tips for taking action. And then we actually have an electronic version of a leave behind that's a quick summary of what Kathleen has covered more extensively. It serves as a reminder or to share with other people about some of the things you've learned tonight, because even though Kathleen does it with no notes, it is a lot to take in one evening. So you'll be hearing from us again, and please feel free to reach out to us as well.
What about the survey?
The survey, yeah.
We can try to post it here, Kathy.
We can either post it in the chat, or maybe we could email it with the other materials. Would that, what would be easier? Just raise your hand if you'd rather by email. Okay, and how many by chat right now? Nobody. Okay.
Okay,
Is that
email.
okay? So I would
And it's
include it in the
really
email.
important to us that you fill it out because it helps us tremendously. We would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Margaret, the exact website address, if you could put on the chat, Sasha would like to know that. She's asked the
Our
question.
website?
Where you want us to post
Do
additional
you want to put that slide up again, Kathleen, or do you want me to just type it in?
CPC.org or
Share screen. Oh, come on. Oh, for some reason, Margaret, it won't
It's
go.
just, yeah,
I got it.
ctconversations.org. Sorry, you and I were doing it.
sorry.
Time.
Yeah.
It's just done. It says I won't go anymore.
Sasha says thank you. So she
Thank
got it.
And Sasha, is your last name start with a capital I or an L?
Hi. Sorry.
I. Okay, got it. Thanks.
Fantastic presentation, Kathleen. And Kathy, thank you for bringing this very important conversation to our community. And it's not the number of people that we have on the screen, but I'm sure each one of us can multiply the effect that you have left on each one of us, like ranging from effect on migration to, I mean, I have asthma. I kind of didn't even connect it that it could be affecting me in that way, into so many, you know, if you look at it, you've not only told such a rich story, but you've said it so extremely well. And thank you so much.
Thank you
Yeah.
all.
And Michelle says, thank you for a great presentation and not leaving us completely without hope.
Yeah.
So, anyway, thank you very, very much. It was just a phenomenal presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rupa and Kathy, for having us.
Bye.